The World Health Organization has developed a model for understanding why violence occurs and how to prevent it. Gareth Newham from the Institute for Security Studies writes that the model explains why South Africa is experiencing such high levels of violence. Well, he's joining us now via Zoom to tell us more about this. Gareth, good afternoon and thank you very much for your time. When I saw the headline of this opinion piece, why is South Africa so violent and what can be done about this and other burning issues, I thought a very apt and timeless kind of topic because of the levels of violence that we see across day in and day out in different communities. So can we just go there first? What led you to start reflecting on this, Gareth?
Well, I think it's a question that many people often ask, and certainly as the Institute for Security Studies, we've been asked this often over the 30 years we've been in existence. And I think why I refer to that model is because it really is based on international studies that show what kind of risk factors are associated with high levels of violence across the world. And then it clusters them into different components, and it really points out that there's not one single or simple answer. So the answer to the question, why is South Africa violent, is not easy to answer. There are many factors at different levels, including our history, overall culture, issues to do with our economy, and the way we're raised in our homes and the beliefs we have that all contribute, for example, to why there's a high level of violence.
Yeah, but it's an important question to ask. I agree with you, and you are been researching this and close to it for many years. Just share at a high level with our viewers who may not be very familiar with this WHO, the World Health Organization's model. What are the key aspects of it that you think could assist us in South Africa in understanding our high levels of violence?
Well, I think you've got to understand that there's sort of historical reasons. South Africa, for most of its history, has been a place of a lot of violence. So contestation since colonialism, apartheid, where the state was the most dominant force in society, was using violence to oppress people and control them. And even in democracy, we have quite a high level of police brutality. Where almost 50,000 complaints have been opened against the police since 2012 with the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, which relate mainly to crimes like assault. So there's state violence, there's a history of that violence, there's inequality of very high levels of inequality, where people feel the system's unfair. We have sort of community level violence where you might have gangs or local level taxi associations that engage in violence in order to solve problems or to deal with conflict. And then many people are raised in homes. We know that about 1/3 of all South Africans, by the time they're 18, have directly been exposed to violence either in their home or in their family. And people who are exposed to violence growing up as children believe that this is just normal. This is just what happens. And if you're a male, you will think that you must use violence in order to solve a problem, to navigate the way in the world. If you're female, you're more likely to believe that it's okay to accept violence in a partner. And many people still believe in corporal punishment. So if you look at all these factors, and there are many more than the ones I've just mentioned, they all come to play in various multiple ways that mean that we're simply not going to have a single simple solution to the problem of violence and murder in South Africa. We have to deploy a variety of our resources across different sectors if we're really going to see a sustainable reduction in violence in our country.
Yeah, so to say our violence nature, I'm using that term very broadly, is endemic and is to be found. Its genesis or its origins and its existence is to be found among all those factors. Therefore, you can't just use one solution. There's no magic wand. But could, for example, addressing economic issues assist to some degrees? I mean, I'm thinking about the high levels of unemployment as an example.
Yes, that would certainly play a role, but it's also not just if we started to have high economic growth. Because if that economic growth isn't inclusive and it brings more people into a feeling that they belong into the community, that they have a way of making money for their families, looking after their loved ones, then sometimes high levels of growth doesn't necessarily change the patterns of violence. So I think what we need to understand that it's not something that you just have to wait until big, massive structural factors change. They are important. But it is more important to understand that we can't just rely, for example, on the police or the criminal justice system to solve murder, for example. We have to start looking at what other ways can we deploy resources. For example, social workers, teachers, healthcare workers, community development workers, private businesses, all have a role to play. If children grow up and they grow up to believe that they can solve problems through dialogue, discussion, they have good problem-solving skills, they understand the importance of not being violent, and they don't experience violence, then they're less likely to be violent in the future. So we could see, if we deployed these resources in a targeted way in our most key, particularly certainly our violent hotspots initially, we could start to see a sustainable reduction in murder within the next decade. And why that's important to say is that because over the last decade, since 2012, every year murder has increased, so that now you're seeing the numbers of murders up about 37% higher than they were 10 years ago. So we're all at more risk the longer we don't really start putting in place concrete, evidence-based strategies at particular localities to try and reduce the kinds of factors that contribute to violence across the country.
I like your mentioning localizing it, because each time, even the police, when they issue their crime stats, for example, on one of the biggest violent crimes of our country today being gender-based violence and femicide, is that most cases, majority of them, are inside homes or in places where people thought it's their loved one that they are with who ends up committing such heinous crimes. So the localization, the involvement of community would be very important, because that's where you could maybe readily and easily find good examples and produce the evidence to show that dialogue works better than fistfights.
Absolutely, and I think one of our challenges is we've got to get out of a mindset that the police or the criminal justice system is the answer. They are very important role players, and of course have to play a role where people have broken the law and committed serious violent crimes. But what we really should be working towards are other interventions that prevent those crimes from happening in the first place. And there are examples in Africa, in places like Kenya and Uganda, where courses taught at high schools over about 6 weeks, from what I recall, have fundamentally changed the attitude of young men and young women to violence against women. Young men, after these are involved in these courses, change their attitudes. They stop using violence against women. They stop using violence against each other. And that effect can last for many years. Yes, so, for example, if we understand the solution also needs to lie on, for example, our schools. It's not only going to be the criminal justice system.
Thank you very much, Gareth Newham. It makes very good sense there. Thanks for your time. He's, of course, from the Institute of Security Studies. Why is South Africa such a violent place, and crime is so violent, and what can be done about it? Not easy, but we need to address it. Let's take